understand. We started the transmission, but it's not the beginning of the webinar. We have 5 minutes more. There will be people from more than 10 different universities and countries, here, including one, I think, from Australia, perhaps, but there are different countries. Estonia, yes, Hungary, Denmark, Belgium, Germany, etc. O, Panie Andrzej, zapraszam, położy Pani profesor.
Nie zasłaniał, ale...
I told Arild that the weather is out of my control in Kraków, but he, as Norwegian, is used to bad weather. So, fortunately, he's not from Italy or Spain. Yeah.
Well, I come from Bergen, and Bergen is known for being very rainy.
Yes.
So,
yeah. I have been twice in Bergen University.
You know the rain then, or from Bergen?
No, at that time it was not raining. It was early autumn, it was okay.
I visited Bergen also twice, as far as I remember, and the weather was sunny, exceptionally good. In February and in July, yes? And every Norwegian told me that this is not true. It's a miracle. Yes? O, zapraszamy dyrektor. To może tutaj gdzieś tam, o, proszę.
Prezydium pan kreuje.
Alicia is director of the Center to teach foreign languages at our university. Bo wczoraj się nie dało połączyć.
Ale nie u Państwa. W samym czasie.
We have 2 minutes more, yes, and generally we would like to finish after about 1 hour, you see. And we like Arild as the other also to have some discussion, yes. And some people from other countries could ask questions in a written form, yeah. So perhaps after the introduction we start with these questions because I guess it's more polite. And then our question. Yeah? Do you accept such formula? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It is our great pleasure to host today Professor Arild Raaheim from Bergen University. And the main topic is flip assessment, an alternative to the traditional university exam. First, there will be not short, but an introduction to the discussion. And in our discussion, participants could ask questions here in this room directly and via YouTube by written chat. Yeah? So, Arild, the floor is yours. Welcome from Krakow, all people who are just now at their laptops.
Thank you very much, Jacek, for this opportunity to share with you some of my ideas about assessment. I've been working with assessment, researching assessment for nearly 35 years. And some of the reason why I decided to work and research questions related to assessment was that as a psychologist I had a lot of students coming to me because they were fearing the exam, they had troubles tackling the exam, and they wanted my help. So this is how I started a long time ago. So what I'd like to do now is to have a presentation, let's say for 30 minutes, maybe a bit more than 30 minutes, and then have questions, first from the net and then from you. And let me start off by just saying something about measurement. I would say that we can make a distinction between two cultures of measurement. One culture, which I would call a testing culture. And I'm sure you're familiar with at least one of these cartoons. Where all the animals are given the same test to climb the tree. This is an international cartoon. And the second one, what do you know, what you're able to do, what kind of skills do you have for real world? Well, I can do tests. I can take tests. So this is one culture that we know of, where universities have been described as exam-giving institutions. This was in fact a description that Norwegian higher education institutions were given by OECD. They wrote a report on Scandinavian higher education, and they described the Norwegian universities as exam-giving institutions. The focus was very much on testing students, to test them to see how much they had been able to obtain and how much they were able to reproduce. So these are some elements of the testing culture. Then the second culture is what I would call an assessment culture, where we have much stronger focus on how students learn. And a lot of this research was inspired by research in Sweden and in Scotland, and after that many other countries, where they were looking into the way students learn and the way assessment affected the way students learn. And then this is just a figure to try to show that assessment is not only something that takes part at the end of a learning process, but assessment takes place as we go along, with a lot of students' work and a lot of formative assessment. But still, it is assessing and testing to some extent, but more focus on the continuous assessment and the formative assessment. This is looking into some details concerning the testing culture. And what we find is that this is, of course, the old and very traditional way that universities have functioned. Lectures are, to a great extent, the definition of universities and higher education institutions. So this is the way we have been doing it for centuries. And testing, exams have been testing which has been coming after a long period of learning and teaching. So there has been a distinction between learning and teaching activities on the one hand, and then testing the exam on the other hand. And very typical, these exams have been in-house exams, closed book exams. They have been written or they have been oral, with invigilation, with people supervising students, making sure that they do not use any books or whatever other things they could think of using, supporting them. So without any help of written or any other material. And one example is, of course, the MCQ, multiple choice questionnaires, have been very often used, and is still in use in many places. But we also had home exams. Students have been given an assignment, given 7 days or 10 days or 14 days maybe, to hand in a written work. What we see in these days is that, much because students have asked it, we see that exams are now not only given in the old-fashioned way, but in the new way, the digital assessment, the digital exam. I have been quite critical towards this new way of assessing students, because this is just doing what we always have been doing, but doing it with new technology, but really without using opportunities and the possibilities that the new technology provides us with. So this is just reinventing the typewriter, really. So it is still a closed book or closed web exam with invigilation, but it's always assessment of learning. So it's a distinction between the learning and teaching process and then the assessment process. And what you can see at the bottom there, you will see two pictures which are very similar. The only difference is that on the picture on the right-hand side, you can see that the students had their computers. They come with their laptops. But as soon as they turn on their laptop and they put in their commands and the net is closed. So what they have is really the same thing as the old-fashioned written exam. The assessment culture is somewhat different, where one looks at assessment as an integrated part of learning, and where we have continuous assessment. And of course, continuous assessment may be done in different ways. It's not necessarily much better than having the big, large assessment at the end. For students who have difficulties with tackling the exam, are nervous, this is perhaps not necessarily a much better way of doing it. But the thing is that once we've decided to do more type of formative assessment, continuous assessment, we also give students feedback. So assessment is not assessment of learning as much as it is assessment for learning. The typical way of doing this is still to have in-house closed book and closed web exams with invigilation, at least at the end. So there are some activities with feedback, some assignments with feedback, which may or may not count towards the mark. But they will most of the time there will be a final assessment, which very often counts, if not 100%, it counts more than activities as we go along. And this final exam is very typical, an in-house, closed book, closed web, with invigilation, with guards, or it could be a home exam or open book exam without invigilation. It can be either thing. So this is assessment for learning. Two quite different cultures. And just look at the words on the right-hand picture there. The root of the word assessment is from the Latin assidere, which means to sit beside. So it's some activity that takes place together with the person who is in fact learning. And it's not necessarily something that is an assessment of something a person has produced before he or she comes to this meeting, or as she comes to this meeting. I've been quite inspired by this Harvard University professor, Arild Raaheim, who is very critical to the assessment at universities. And he calls assessment, any type of assessment, as we are doing at universities, he calls them the silent killer of learning. And he claims that learning should be, it is and it should be, a process whereby one solves problems. And he says, problem solving involves making mistakes. Show me the successful professor who has not made any mistake. Show me the successful invention which is not built on years and years of trial and error. But it's all about making mistakes. Learning is all about making mistakes, he claims. But what is assessment about? What are exams? His claim is that our assessment practice is about penalizing mistakes. It makes students afraid of making mistakes. So in fact, it makes students afraid of learning. And it kills all forms of creativity, especially exams. Kill curiosity. Exams test memorization, not necessarily problem-solving abilities. These are the claims of Arild Raaheim, a well-known professor of physics at Harvard University. I think we have a lot to learn from what he is saying. These are some concerns that I have been met with by my colleagues at the University of Bergen. My position at the university is one in which I have workshops for university professors, trying to help them to become better teachers and educators. And they very often come to me with different types of queries and questions. And these are just two examples. The first one is an example from a professor of philosophy who came to me and said that we have a problem. Even in my field, philosophy, students only regurgitate parts of the curriculum. And they are not able to, or they don't seem to be able to analyze and discuss. So what can I do? What should we do? His question was to me. My answer to this professor comes a bit later. I did answer his question. The second one is from the Dean at our Faculty of Law, Dean of Education. Very much the same concern, but there was something in addition to the professor of philosophy. He says that what we have is, we have 4 our written exams, we have a lot of lectures. Every lecture is videotaped and it's put on the net because students demand it of us, he says. But what we find is that students, they just repeat what is presented in lectures. And again, they seem to be not to be able to discuss and critically analyze the material. And he asked me, could we do the following? Could we add on 2 more hours to the written exam and then demand that students spend the 2 last hours critically analyze? My response to this person was that maybe you should have a closer look at the way you teach. Maybe there is something wrong in the way you teach. Maybe you should not have done what the students demanded you to do, namely videotape everything. Because what do we know about student behavior? When we do this, do students read the books, or do they just look at the same video again and again? What kind of effect does this have on student behavior? We have to be sensitive to that. So maybe you should have a look at the way you teach. This is taken from an interview, and it's my translation. You can see, maybe not understand the bottom lines, which is in Norwegian, but this is my translation. This was an interview made only a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. And this is a person leading or being the HR director in a large Norwegian company. And what she says is that in our business and in working life, competences is rapidly changing and outdated. So the candidate's ability to learn becomes more important than grades. And it becomes more important than the name of the educational institutions where they come from. So again, she says more or less the same as Arild Raaheim. The student's ability to solve problems, to learn, is more important than the fact that they can show that they have a lot of knowledge, which much of it will be outdated in not too long time. So this is probably, this is why Bowden and his colleagues say that we have to, when we plan teaching and educational problems, we have to change from what they call a content focus towards a capability focused curriculum. So not testing, not teaching a lot of facts, not testing a lot of facts and knowledge, but teaching students the ability to solve problems. Teaching students how to learn. Using, of course, our subject. So this ability used on the subject. So what we need is to have students build this knowledge capability, to take on this knowledge capability. And knowledge capability, as they define it, is very much similar to what Raaheim calls problem solving. So, what we can say from research, and what is quite definite, is that the way we assess students determines what students learn, how students learn, but also affects students' conceptions of knowledge. What does it mean to know? And there is a reference there to a paper, article by Australian researcher, Karen Scholar. It's now becoming a bit old, but it's still worthwhile looking into that reference, where she in fact shows that the type of assessment that we confront students with has an effect not only on the way they learn, the learning strategies they use, not only on the result that they are able to show, but it also has an effect on the way they perceive the subject and the relevance of that kind of knowledge. It has an effect on students' conceptions of knowledge. Knowing that assessment is the most powerful tool we have to affect and direct student learning, we should be more conscious about using this and how to use it. So for the rest of my talk now, I'll try and look at that. And this is why I have not invented the word flipped assessment, but it's not very often used in literature. I've come across one paper which has used the same term. So, knowing that assessment is very important and the most powerful tool that we have, what is it that we want students to learn? This is the question we need to ask ourselves. What is it that we want students to learn? And I guess you in Poland and in other countries in Europe have done the same exercise that we have been doing in Norway, implementing the European qualification frameworks for lifelong learning and writing all these learning outcomes. And the way we rephrase these learning outcomes, the words that we use are important because they have a bearing on how we can assess students and how we ought to assess students. And it's very different. Recall, describe, explain, discuss, and so on. All of these are very different things. And my challenge to you and to us is, how can we best assess these different things? Are they best assessed by a closed book exam? Can you assess a student's ability to demonstrate the same way you can assess a student's ability to recall? We have to be conscious about this, that these words demand different things, and they should be assessed differently. And this, you might be aware about of this. John Biggs, the Australian researchers, questions to us, demand really to us, saying that we have to make sure that there is a constructive alignment between what we state in the learning outcomes, saying what we say about student learning on the one hand, and the way we teach students and the different teaching and learning activities that we use, and the way we assess students. There has to be a relationship, a connection, what he calls a constructive alignment. Stating one thing has to lead to ways, special ways of teaching and learning, which are different if the statement is another one is the different one. So, what is flipped assessment? What do I mean by flipped assessment? Well, before going into some examples of this, I would say that we have to take into consideration that learning is something that takes place in students' time. It takes place in students' time through the kind of activities that they engage in alone or together with peers. Or together with the instructor or teacher. Having said that, flipped assessment is all about what we could call a learning-oriented assessment. So not looking so much at how much a student has learned, not so much on how students learn, different learning strategies they use, but on what students learn. Flipped assessment involves making students, or it implies making students actively involved in assessment. Making them actively engage with writing the assessment criteria, having their opinion about quality, how these criteria have been mapped, and involving their own and peers' performance, an assessment of their own and their peers' performance. So this is really learning to learn, and it's assessment as learning. So while the testing culture is assessment of learning, the distinction between learning, teaching activities on the one hand and testing on the other, and where the assessment culture is assessment for learning, and the formative aspect is important and feedback is important, this is assessment as learning, because students are actively engaged in assessment of themselves. So this is one example of flipped assessment, and I have 5 examples which are not always very different, but builds on each other. So one example of flipped assessment is making students work together with teacher to create marking criteria. So based on what is stated in the study plan and the learning outcomes which have been stated there, students and teacher cooperate in creating marking criteria. There have to be some sort of documentation, of course. There is some sort of documentation. It could be very much different things. And then the final mark that the students get on these documentations is a negotiated product between how they assess themselves, their self-assessment, how peers have assessed them, and teachers' assessment. So it's a negotiated product of all these kind of assessments. Making the student not only deciding, having a voice in saying something about the criteria, but also having the students have a voice in the assessment process of themselves. There is a reference to this, to someone who's really done this. So there's a reference below. The co-creation of marking criteria. So this is in fact something that is possible to do with success. A second example of flipped assessment is what I call assessment before, during, and after teaching and learning activities. So it builds on the former one, where you have assessment before the whole thing starts, where students are cooperating on developing criteria and what you could call a holistic rubric, a general holistic rubric based on stated learning outcomes from the study plan. Because this gives the students a voice into the whole process, saying, where am I supposed to go? What is the point in this program? What am I supposed to learn? And then we have a process where students are invited to assess themselves, and not only assess themselves, but also assess the kind of learning and teaching activities they are involved in during learning and teaching activities. So it's a self-assessment on the assignments, their performance on the assignments that they're giving, and they are asked to elaborate on the rubric and the criteria that they develop, because they have no more information, more knowledge, and they can elaborate on this. This also serves as a feedback to the teacher, saying, what directions are we going in? Are we going in the direction that we agreed on as we started? And it gives the student feedback to himself or herself, saying, well, where am I? What do I need to do in order to go back on track, or to proceed towards the goal. And then you have, after the learning and teaching activities have taken place, you have an assessment afterwards. Self-assessment, peer assessment, and teacher assessment. And this is not necessarily assessing how much I've learned, but how did I learn? So this is on a meta level. What did I learn about learning? Being involved in all these criteria. What are transferable skills that I can take with me to other contexts? What did I learn about learning? So it's how did I perform, yes, but how did I learn? So this is assessment as learning. So these are two examples. A third one is really flipping in the sense that instead of asking students to fill in, let's say, MCQ test, we provide the students with an MCQ test that we have filled in. But we have made sure that there are some wrong crosses, or some wrong answers. We ask the students not to fill in the test, but look at the result, look at the answers, and then say, and we say to the students, there are some wrong answers in this. Could you please find the wrong answers? But not only find the wrong answers, could you please say something like, why are they wrong? What's wrong with them? And what should be there instead? They have to have a lot of knowledge to be able to detect what is wrong, and they have to be able to reflect and analyze in order to provide the correct answer. And not only provide the correct answer, but stating why this is correct. So this is taking the multiple choice test to another dimension. Because we know that it is a good test, but only limited to the very, what we can see, basic cognitive skills. Or we could even, as an alternative, have students develop an MCQ test based on what they have been doing during the course. So the exam is really making a test, which we could use for the students. You have to have a lot of knowledge. I don't know if you've been involved in making these kind of tests. It's a lot of work, it's hard work, and it's hard to find sensible, meaningful alternatives. And you have to have a lot of details and overview in order to be able to do this. So it's a skill. And then they could write a reflective note on where they argue for choice of questions and answers. So it's not only making, but asking, why should this be a question that we should pose to students? And I'm sure that the kind of test that students would develop is quite different from the ones that we develop. I'm quite sure. This is my answer to the professor of philosophy. I said, instead of giving the students 4-hour in-house closed book exam where students are given a question, a problem to discuss, and then write a long discussion on this, a long paper. Could you not flip this so that you write an answer to this question? And what students are handed out at the exam is your answer. And then they have to read this answer, and then they have to say, well, was this a good answer to that question? Why was it good? Why was it not so good? What was lacking? What should have been there, which is not? What part of the literature has not been touched on? And of course, this assessment has to be based on a set of explicit criteria. And again, the students could have been asked to develop these criteria at the beginning of the course. So this doesn't cost anything more, it doesn't take more resources, it's exactly the same layout, but it's flipping in the sense that students are asked to do something different than what they usually do. And the last example is, I don't know if it's correct to call it the flipped assessment, but this is also something that Eric Musser is asking. Open book, open web exam. Why on earth should we not let students have all the kind of information they need during the exam? So open up the web, let them use whatever resources are out there, let them use all the kind of information there is out there. But what we have to test is not their ability to reproduce or to show that they understand, but the way they use the different sources. So it's not asking them, could you please say what Freud would have answered on this particular question. So we have to ask different types of questions. And it would be more demanding on us, much more demanding than just reading a paper. And when you've done that a couple of 100 and 1,000 times, you do it in a second, some seconds. And this is in fact something which has been tested as well. Some of Finnish colleagues have had an open book, open web online examination with success. There's a reference to this. So it's something I've argued for many, many years. And it's something that we are now hoping that the Faculty of Law at the University of Bergen will try out. Because what they say is that students spend so much time on reading and remembering all these laws that has been in the High Court, and it's unnecessary because they are all there. So we can open a web and give them all these sources. So what we are testing them on is not whether or not they're able to reproduce, but how they use this in discussing something different. So we'll hopefully try to do that. When we decide on the type of assessment that we want to use, maybe we should try to look at this, what we call the big five of assessment. How concerned should we be about reliability? The fact that different assessors would assess more or less the same thing. How concerned should we be about that? We know that reliability is a difficult thing. The way we've been doing it for centuries is not necessarily very reliable. So it is a thing that we have to discuss. But should we be concerned about this? If yes, it has some bearing on the type of assessment that we can use. How much should we focus on validity? External validity, for example. Remember what the HR director said. How much should we be concerned with authenticity and transparency and fairness, having the student's voice into this? So we have to look at these things and we have to decide, and it's up to us. So this is what I wanted to share with you, ideas, thoughts, and there are some literature that you could have a look at.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your introduction. And we have questions of our friends from Denmark, from Karen, and also from Saka. So these are questions, so perhaps you should answer the question. Perhaps read once more, please.
So Karen asked us, concerning students' higher order capabilities, to which extent is this a question of didactic choices of teaching learning activities or of assessment forms? Well, I think it's a combination. You can't say one thing without the other. So it has to do both with teaching and learning activities and with assessment forms. What we know is that if you give assessment in the traditional way, and if you use a lot of multiple choice questionnaire type of test, then this has an effect, very specific effect on students' learning. With reproduction as a result, maybe. Flipped assessment 4, you talk about the pros. What are the cons?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Only advantages, you know.
Of course there are advantages and there are disadvantages. Absolutely. One very obvious disadvantage with most of these different alternatives that I've given you is concerned with cheating. Taking something which somebody else has produced and handing it in as something that you've been doing. Using the net not only as a basis for discussion and seeking information, but also seeking answers that you just can copy. Of course, this is a problem. I'm not blind to that. But if this is a very severe concern of yours, then maybe you should not choose this alternative. Maybe you should stick to the exam. So I'm not saying that we should skip exam, the traditional exam. What I'm saying is that what do we say in the learning outcomes? They have to be decisive for the type of assessment that we use. So if you say something like saying that what we want students to develop is skills and so and so and so and so, and then you have to test this. And you have to find the best way to test it. And it's not necessarily an exam, but in some cases it could be the exam. And if it is, stick to the exam.
And Sakayaga.
Sakayaga, how to start convincing your university that this kind of testing is needed instead of the traditional format? Universities in Netherlands invest heavily in digital testing facilities like the one you showed. The more people who can say this convincingly, relating this to research, where people have tried out the alternatives and discussed the pros and cons. The more people who can do that, the more convinced universities will be. What I find is very interesting. I've been trying to say this for many years. My university doesn't necessarily listen to me, but when Erik Masur and when Carl Riemann talk about this in the States, and suddenly they begin to realize that maybe we should move in that direction. What is a problem in both, I'm sure, in Netherlands and in Norway, is that we have invested so much on these rooms where we can have students come in with our computer to do the digital exam. And I said, when we invest so much money in this, it becomes something that we need to show that we have been, it's worthwhile. So what we need now is to discuss other rooms to have learning and teaching activities in. So when we rebuild the universities, let's bring the architects in, architects who are also aware of some of the pedagogics. And we have to reshape the rooms.
And the question from Austria.
Elisa Scheer, wouldn't you say that subject knowledge is the basis for problem solving? At least for more sophisticated problems, you need a basis of subject knowledge, theoretical knowledge. Well, I don't disagree. Of course, subject knowledge is important. But what is taking place in the exam, the typical exam, is far from problem solving. It has very little to do with problem solving. So if you are fine with the situation, I shouldn't say you have a problem, but I'm not fine with that. But of course, subject knowledge is important. So I'm not arguing against subject knowledge, but I'm saying subject knowledge can be both assessed and achieved in different ways.
So a question from Kenya, Hungary. Yes.
Is
A person
that
from Kenya living now in Hungary.
that's Monero?
Yeah, this one.
That one?
Yeah.
Hello everyone. Luis Atiena from Kenya, but currently in Hungary. In my country, we are still using testing culture. How best can a teacher bring in the flipped assessment in such a scenario?
Well, again, I think more or less the same answer as I gave a minute ago. Look into the literature, give examples of how this has been done in different contexts, highlight this, share it with your colleagues, and maybe you could do as I did at the University of Bergen, apply for money to do some alternative teaching and alternative testing, making sure that you do systematic evaluation of this, and you write this up, hand it into scientific journals, and spread the word, showing your colleagues that it is possible. But of course, being aware of the cons as well.
So now time for the question of us.
Okay.
Yeah. So actually, at my university or our university, there are attempts of flip assessment. Yes. Piotr, could you say something about your initiative?
Well, I mean, basically, I'm very much grateful to you for your words and for very precise assessment of how to proceed with the assessments. And I really like the idea of assessments of moving of assessments of learning to assessments for and us. That's really good. I started with the idea of lacking ability of students, of our students, of asking questions. Because usually we are the masters of questions. So I give it over to them, this ability, according to this Isidore Isaac. Did you ask the good question? You know the story, probably. So well, after first semester I had 75 students. I asked everyone to prepare 10 questions and do some extra ones if they wish. I had 1,400 questions.
Good questions.
And it's a very good question. What they were good questions. And this was just the beginning. And I went this way. And eventually you finish at the money issue. Money is time. And the question is really of time, of doing these flip assessments, because it's time consuming.
Yes.
It's for such a big group, for 75 students, is really overwhelming sometimes. Ability of asking questions, I mean, spending the time for them, saying, well, why did you ask this question? What are the validity? What your reference? Because I ask them to read something, to take a picture of what you are reading from the lectures, from the list of the articles that I offer. Get to the syllabus, get to the reading document, and ask questions about this written document, based on this written document. Mm-hmm. So not out of the blue, but out of the concrete of the subject that we are working.
Yeah.
So that was my basis. But I really like the thing that you ask about money from the university. Mm-hmm. What was the response of your university?
Well, I've been lucky in the sense that I've been given quite a lot of money to do research on this, and they didn't give me money to research teaching and learning and assessment activities on subjects that really mattered. But I was able to have a group or a subject which didn't count towards. This was in psychology, and it didn't count towards a psychology program. So students came there voluntarily. And I said to the university, I would like to do some research on teaching and learning activities on this. And they said, okay, good, you can do that. So I had quite a lot of money for many years to do that. And now it pays off in the sense that people are listening to this. But also, maybe I should say that in Norway we have this system which we really have adopted from Finland and Britain, where we have centers of excellence in university education. And I was lucky enough to be asked by the Department of Biology at university to be part of their group writing an application for the Center of Excellence. And we were successful. So we became a Center of Excellence in University Education. And now I have 2 PhD candidates who are researching what we are doing in terms of teaching and assessment. So we have, one thing that we stated in our application was that by the end of the first year, we should reduce number of lectures with 25%. And we thought, when we reduce something, we have to put something in instead. So we have been adopting team-based learning, different other types of learning, and we have been researching this and we publish on this.
Yeah. So among us, there is Professor Jadwiga Mirecka, very active in test examination, but also in other types of assessment. Would you like to comment or ask something?
Well, one comment. If I understood it well, you are using that for formative assessment, not for summative assessment. Because that would create problems.
We can also have summative assessment.
You try to do it, okay. Because we have problem with summative assessment that we are obliged to put ahead in our syllabuses the criteria for assessment.
Yeah.
So we cannot use students to elaborate on that. And the other thing which I wanted to ask is, did you try to engage your students in setting criteria for oral examination?
No, we haven't done that, no. But what you're saying, I totally agree. We have to, when we are discussing other types of assessments, we have to have a closer look at the rules and regulations at the university. In Norway, we have this national law saying something about assessment. But it is really giving us a great opportunity to do different types of things. But the higher education institutions themselves, they have narrowed this down.
Yeah,
and the rules and regulations have to be opened up. And we have now a discussion with the department, the Ministry of Education in Norway, and that said to us, well, it's up to the university. So we have confronted the university saying that you have to open up. Because what you say in your plans makes it impossible for us to do this, that, and so on.
No, the point is that we have to write ahead what is the passing level.
Yeah.
So we can't rely on students preparing the criteria.
No.
Because we have to define them before.
Yeah.
Yes, but this is not the ministry regulation. This is not in the law, but this is again as in Norway.
Yeah.
This is university regulation. So we can think about it to change this regulation, and I think it is possible.
Yeah. So among us there is Professor Cihan, rector's proxy for the excellence in
quality assurance.
Quality assurance. So do you accept this idea of
yeah, definitely. I like this idea very much. So I am quite open to discuss about changes at the level of the university regulations.
Yeah. But the question of Sake Jager, how to convince rectors, etc. Even not rectors, but the atmosphere,
It's not easy, but we can try. If no one tries, then no one wins.
Very vague answer.
I would not see any problem in using that for formative assessment. This, I think, can be done immediately without breaking any regulations. With summative, I would still hesitate because I think it would make students uncertain. What would be expected from them at the end?
Yeah.
Unless we inform them that will be the way of developing.
Okay, I think again that it will depend on the type of subject of discipline.
Yeah, definitely. I
Because
agree.
if there is a certain amount of solid knowledge required from them, that they would rather prefer to know it ahead before the beginning of the
But what
course.
we have to do is convince the students and our colleagues that what we are doing now is part of teaching, part of learning.
Good.
So we don't, and I know that students, they are very concerned about assessment, of course, and marks, they're very concerned about marks. And we have to be careful in pushing this on students. We have to have students on board and discuss with them and convince them that we are now not taking resources from, or putting much resources into assessment. We are putting more resources into teaching, really. Because what we are now dealing with is part of the learning process. It's not assessment. I work very hard, yes, and you work very hard, but this is learning activities. But when I ask my colleagues at the University of Bergen, I say, why don't you change the way you assess students? They come up with 3 answers. They say, it takes too much time to work out new ways of doing this. And I don't know if I am teaching the same course next year, so I don't see any reason why I should
invest so much time in developing new systems of assessment.
And it works well for me. And then the other one they say is that we have these rules and regulations. I have to plan many years ahead. So what I'm planning now is something that I cannot do until at least 1 year, maybe 1.5. So.
Okay. So the last question, perhaps Dr. Andrzej Komanowicz of Collegium Medicum of the Jagiellonian University.
I wonder about your opinion on what's the right place in the curriculum for flipped assessment. Is it something that novice students can already do, or is it something more for senior, or it should be equally uniform balanced? What's your opinion on it?
Well, I have good faith in human beings, and I have good faith in young people. I have good faith in students. So I mean that this is something we can do at a very early stage with first-year students. So it's not something that we need to reserve for master students, for example, or PhD students. And I'm quite critical also towards the European qualification framework, the way it has been put out, spelled out. Looking, for example, at the way we are asked to write learning outcomes on knowledge, you see that on the bachelor level, we are asked to write learning outcomes to the fact that students are able to reproduce knowledge, to show that they have knowledge. When we come to the master's level, we have to write learning outcomes showing that students are able to use knowledge. At the PhD level, we are asked to write learning outcomes to the fact that the candidates are able to produce new knowledge. I would say that why shouldn't I demand and expect that already bachelor students could be able, together with me, together with peers, produce new knowledge? I'm open to that. And when you use peer assessment, I've been doing studies where I've had novel students, first semester students, asking them to assess peers, and then having experienced assessors coming in and doing the same assessment. I find they are very similar in their assessment. Students are more merging around the mean, but very, very close relationship between very experienced and the novice.
Okay. So last 2 minutes, they are for you.
Well, I think I've spent so many minutes talking, both
beforehand and when I'm answering the question. So I saw that you had a question, so maybe you should have.
I just completely agree with you regarding this. From my experience, if you start sooner, then it's better. Because the same thing, this bank of questions doesn't work with this master degree. People who used to totally different system. The first year works the best. When they are at the university, they're enthusiastic to new methods, and they are willing to do exactly
for new experience.
So later, when I had older students, they say, "Okay, you just give me whatever."
I agree with you. They are open, they are open-minded, they're welcoming. And again, if they don't learn it early on, how should we expect them to learn it later on? So we have to start at a very early age. And I really disagree with a lot of my colleagues around Norway who state that they say that what we are now having, because we are having more and more students coming into university, they say that the level is going down. These young people, they know much more than I knew. Not only more, but they are much more clever than I was when I was a student. The new generation is superb. We have a new generation of young people. They are very skillful, and they know a lot. So let's welcome them in, and let's show that we can play together with them.
So this was your creed, yes.
Absolutely.
At the end of our seminar.
Okay.
So I would like to thank everybody from Groningen, Aarhus, from Hungary, and many other places in Europe, and you here at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And last but not least, to our guest today, Professor Arild Raaheim. Yes, thank you very much indeed. So it's time to personal discussion and questions.
And I think that this kind of activity is important.